Welcome to the silent verdict.
With Clara Monroe and Elias Gray.
Can the U.S. government really deport its own citizens? The answer, well, based on what we've dug into, it might just shock you.
Yeah, it's pretty startling stuff. We're not just talking hypotheticals here. There are these alarming reports about actual U.S. citizen kids, even a toddler with cancer reportedly being deported.
And it opens up this bigger question too, doesn't it? Could the government legally ship off any U.S. citizen, even so-called homegrown criminals, send them to prisons overseas?
Exactly. That's what we're diving into. We've looked at the reports of these deportations and also the legal analyses surrounding some proposals from the previous administration.
Our mission really is to understand what protections U.S. citizens actually have against being, forced out of the country or locked up abroad.
Okay, so let's start with those specific reports about the children. These involve the Trump administration.
Right. The stories were about U.S. citizen children being deported seemingly alongside their mothers during, routine immigration check-ins.
Yeah, one case that stands out is a 2-year-old girl born in New Orleans, a U.S. citizen, reportedly deported to Honduras with her mom.
Just incredible. And there were others.
Yes, 2 more, ages 4 and 7. And one of those kids, the 7-year-old, I think, was actually battling cancer at the time. They were also reportedly deported with their mother.
How? How does something like that even happen, especially with a 2-year-old?
Well, that case is particularly revealing. A judge actually weighed in pretty heavily.
What did the judge say?
Issued a really strong rebuke, said flat out it's illegal and unconstitutional to detain or deport a U.S. citizen.
Okay, so legally it shouldn't happen, but it did. What was the government's justification?
The government's line was that the mother wanted the child to go with her. Consent, basically.
Wait, was that actually true?
Well, the father strongly disputed that claim. He said, no, that's not what happened.
And the court?
The court noted something really disturbing. They pointed out the child was likely already in Honduras before they even had a chance to talk to the mother.
Wait, so the deportation happened before any real legal process or check could occur?
It certainly looks that way. A U.S. citizen removed before their rights could even be, properly considered by the court.
That immediately flags the whole issue of due process, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The 5th and 14th Amendments are crystal clear. U.S. citizens can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
And due process in, say, a criminal context means specific things, right? Like notice, a hearing.
Exactly. Notice of charges, a chance to be heard, an impartial judge, presenting evidence, confronting witnesses, access to evidence, right to a lawyer, the whole package.
So where was that process for these children?
That's the million-dollar question. It seems like it was completely bypassed.
And this wasn't the only sort of boundary-pushing idea floating around, was it? There was talk about adult citizens, too.
Right. We also saw reports about President Trump expressing a desire to send homegrown criminals to what was described as a foreign gulag in El Salvador.
A foreign gulag? Seriously, was this confirmed?
His press secretary did confirm he was interested in the idea, yeah. And that the attorney general at the time, Pam Bondi, was tasked with looking into whether it was legal.
So the question was seriously being asked. Could the U.S. essentially offshore its prisons for its own citizens?
It seems so. It takes you down a rabbit hole. Like, could the government just decide to run all its prisons overseas, send American citizens away to serve sentences elsewhere?
Sounds like something out of a dystopian movie, but apparently it was on the table.
So let's pull back and look at the core legal hurdles here. What are the big legal principles standing in the way?
Due process is the big one we just mentioned.
Definitely. The 5th and 14th Amendments, that's the bedrock. Protection against arbitrary government action taking away liberty.
And those specific procedural rights you listed for criminal cases.
Notice, hearing, counsel, all of that. You look at deporting citizen kids or shipping convicts overseas. It just doesn't seem to square with those rights at all.
It feels like a shortcut around the whole system. Isn't there also a law specifically about detaining citizens?
Yes, there is. It's called the Non-Detention Act.
What does that say?
It explicitly prohibits the U.S. government from imprisoning or detaining a U.S. citizen unless Congress has passed a specific law authorizing it.
So where's the act of Congress saying it's okay to deport citizen kids or send citizens to Salvadoran prisons?
Good question. It doesn't appear to exist. These actions seem to run right up against that act.
And what if someone is detained unlawfully? What's the recourse?
That's the fundamental right of habeas corpus, the right to challenge your detention in court, to make the government justify why they're holding you.
And that applies even in extreme situations, right? Like Guantanamo.
Exactly. The Supreme Court case, Rasul v. Bush, established that even detainees held offshore at Guantanamo by the military still had the right to bring habeas corpus challenges in U.S. courts.
So if non-citizens held offshore have that right, surely U.S. citizens do too, maybe even more strongly.
You'd absolutely think so. And in another case, Hamdi v. Rumsfeld is relevant here too.
That involved a U.S. citizen captured in Afghanistan.
Right. Yasser Hamdi. Now, the Supreme Court said the authorization for use of military force, the AUMF passed after 9/11, did count as an act of Congress satisfying the Non-Detention Act for his specific wartime detention.
Ah, okay. So detention was allowed there.
But, and this is crucial, the court also said that even as an enemy combatant in wartime, Hamdi, as a U.S. citizen, was still entitled to due process. He had the right to challenge the factual basis for his detention before a neutral decision maker.
So even in war, citizenship means you retain fundamental due process rights. The government can't just lock you up and throw away the key.
Precisely. It underscores that citizenship carries inherent protections. Now, let's think historically about sending people away. Exile.
Yeah, that's not a new concept. Britain did it, sending people to the colonies, including here in America.
And how was that viewed by the colonists and later the founders?
They hated it. It was actually listed as one of the grievances against King George III in the Declaration of Independence, transporting people overseas for trial.
Why was it seen as so cruel back then? What made exile such a harsh punishment?
Well, being ripped away from your family, your community, everything you know. Total isolation.
And vulnerability to abuse, right. Plus, even if the sentence wasn't technically life, getting back home was often impossible financially. It effectively was a life sentence.
Erasing someone from their society. Does modern law reflect any of that concern about location?
It does, actually. Look at the First Step Act passed in 2018.
The Criminal Justice Reform Bill.
Yeah. It includes a provision that says the Bureau of Prisons should try to house inmates, preferably within 500 driving miles of their primary residence.
Why is that?
The idea is to make it easier for families to visit, maintain those community ties. It recognizes that connection is important for rehabilitation.
So sending someone to El Salvador, that kind of blows that principle out of the water, doesn't it?
Completely contradicts it. It shows a modern understanding that keeping people connected, not isolating them thousands of miles away, is generally the goal. Unless there's some super compelling reason, sending someone overseas just doesn't fit.
Okay, but what about the most basic right? The right to just be here in the U.S. as a citizen.
That feels like the absolute core of citizenship, doesn't it? And courts have spoken on this.
They have.
Yes. A key case is Doe v. Mattis from the D.C. Circuit Court in 2017.
What did that court say?
They stated very clearly that a fundamental attribute of United States citizenship is a right to remain in this country and to return after leaving.
A right to remain.
And they specifically said that forcibly transferring an American citizen into another country's custody violates that right. That seems like a major roadblock.
Wow, okay. And does the government itself acknowledge this right?
Interestingly, yes. If you look at the website for Customs and Border Protection, CBP.
The agency at the border.
Right. Their site explicitly says, quote, a U.S. citizen's right to remain in the United States cannot be taken away.
So even the border agency says you can't kick citizens out.
It's stated as a fundamental principle. So if you can't easily deport a citizen, what about trying to strip their citizenship first, make them deportable that way?
Ah, the loophole approach. Can the government just take away citizenship?
Well, the 14th Amendment grants citizenship to almost everyone born or naturalized here. That's birthright citizenship.
Okay.
And the courts have been very, very reluctant to allow the government to involuntarily revoke citizenship. Generally, you have to choose to give it up, voluntarily relinquish it.
So it's not a punishment the government can impose, like you committed a crime, now you're not a citizen.
Definitely not. The Supreme Court, in a famous case called Trop v. Dulles, actually called the idea of stripping citizenship as punishment more primitive than torture.
More primitive than torture. That's strong language.
It really shows how fundamental citizenship is seen. And another case, Afrim v. Rust, confirmed you can't lose citizenship unless you voluntarily renounce it.
So taking away citizenship to make deportation easier seems like a non-starter legally.
It faces huge constitutional hurdles. Now, shifting gears slightly, let's talk about where these proposals suggested sending people, specifically El Salvador.
All right, the foreign gulag. What do we know about the prison conditions there? particularly at the facility often mentioned, SECOT.
The reports are, frankly, horrifying. And they bring up another major legal issue, the Convention Against Torture.
That's an international treaty.
Yes, one the U.S. is party to. It forbids sending anyone to a country where there are substantial grounds to believe they'd be subjected to torture.
And the conditions in Salvadoran prisons raise those concerns.
Massively. There are numerous credible reports, including from the U.S. State Department itself, of severe human rights violations. We're talking hundreds of inmate deaths in just 1 year linked to things like torture, beating, strangulation, and denial of medical care.
That's appalling. What kind of details are we talking about?
Autopsies showing horrific injuries, survivor accounts of electrocution, people dying from untreated infections because medical help was refused.
And basic conditions.
Reports describe cells with no windows, terrible overcrowding, lack of ventilation in a tropical climate, denial of basics like reading materials, family visits, exercise, outdoor time, health care. It's grim.
Our own Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, the Eighth Amendment. Would sending Americans there violate that?
It almost certainly seems like it would. The conditions described systematic abuse, deliberate indifference to suffering leading to death. The sheer inhumanity of the overcrowding look like a clear violation of Eighth Amendment standards.
Overcrowding? How bad?
Analyses suggest that at full capacity in SECOT, prisoners might have less than 2 square feet of space each in these shared cells.
Less than 2 square feet. That's unthinkable.
Yeah, it's been pointed out that's less space than required for transporting some livestock in Europe. There's testimony from a doctor about guards just ignoring pleas for help, leading directly to deaths.
And reports of torture upon arrival.
Yes, new inmates allegedly being beaten and tortured to force them to declare a gang affiliation, whether true or not. It's a system described as rife with abuse.
Okay, so sending people there seems fraught with legal and ethical problems. Is there any way the U.S. can legally send a citizen to be imprisoned abroad?
The one established clear legal pathway is through extradition treaties.
How does that work?
If a U.S. citizen commits a crime in another country, and we have an extradition treaty with that country covering that crime, then yes. But, importantly, there has to be a process here in the U.S. first. A hearing in a U.S. court to establish there's enough evidence to justify sending them over.
So it's not just the president deciding to ship someone off. There's a legal process involving our courts.
Exactly. Cases like Valentine v. U.S. and Doe v. Mattis confirm this framework. It requires due process here before anyone is sent away to face justice there.
Okay. So wrapping all this together, what are the main arguments against what was reportedly done with the children and what was proposed for adult citizens?
Well, the core argument is that these actions just seem to fly in the face of fundamental constitutional rights, primarily due process under the 5th and 14th Amendments.
Right, bypassing the whole system.
Yeah, circumventing the established legal and judicial process. Then there's the Non-Detention Act, a direct statutory barrier, unless Congress acts.
And the right to remain.
The fundamental right of a citizen to be in their own country as affirmed by the courts. Plus, the historical view of exile as cruel punishment echoed in the First Step Act's preference for keeping inmates close to home.
And the citizenship issue.
The extreme difficulty, legally and constitutionally, of involuntarily stripping someone of their U.S. citizenship.
And finally, the destination itself.
Sending anyone, let alone a U.S. citizen, to a place like SECOT with its documented record of torture and inhumane conditions raises huge red flags under the Eighth Amendment and the Convention Against Torture.
It seems like a lot of legal obstacles. Were there specific moments or rulings that really stand out as turning points here?
I think so. The initial reports about the citizen children being deported, that really brought the issue to light in a visceral way.
And the president's talk about foreign prisons.
That signaled an intent, at least, to push these boundaries. Then you have the judge's very strong language calling the child's deportation illegal and unconstitutional.
What about Supreme Court cases?
Definitely Hamdi, affirming due process even in wartime for citizens, and Rasul confirming habeas rights even for non-citizens offshore. Those set important precedents.
And the right to stay here.
The Doe v. Mattis ruling from the D.C. Circuit, explicitly calling the right to remain a fundamental attribute of citizenship, is significant.
As is the difficulty of stripping citizenship.
Yes. Trop v. Dulles calling it more primitive than torture really sticks with you.
And finally, the sheer weight of evidence about the conditions in El Salvador.
Absolutely. The extensive documentation of human rights abuses there makes the idea of sending U.S. citizens into that system deeply problematic.
So, bringing it all together, what's the verdict? Legally speaking, can the U.S. government do these things?
Based on everything we've looked at the Constitution, statutes like the Non-Detention Act, court precedents, international law, the forced deportation of U.S. citizens, especially without due process, seems illegal and unconstitutional.
And sending citizens to foreign prisons like SECET?
That faces enormous legal hurdles. Due process violations, the Non-Detention Act, the First Step Act, the fundamental right to remain, the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment, and the Convention Against Torture. It looks like a legal minefield.
Even in the cases of the children where consent was claimed.
The process seemed deeply flawed. There wasn't a proper legal proceeding to really determine if consent was validly given or, more importantly, to protect the independent rights of the U.S. citizen child.
So the takeaway seems to be that despite alarming headlines or proposals, the legal framework protecting citizens is pretty strong.
It appears to be, yes. The rights of U.S. citizens, due process, the right to remain, protection from cruel punishment. These are substantial barriers against arbitrary government action. The idea of just, quickly removing citizens or outsourcing their imprisonment to bypass these rights seems legally very shaky.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What does citizenship actually guarantee? What are the real limits on what a government can do to its own people?
That's the fundamental question these situations raise, and it's one worth serious reflection for all of us.
Absolutely. The thought of any American citizen, but especially kids, being potentially swept away without due process, possibly sent into harm's way, it's deeply unsettling.
It really is.
And it just highlights how crucial it is to understand these rights and make sure they're protected.
Yeah, vigilance is key.
This dive shows that while proposals can sound extreme, the legal guardrails protecting citizens are significant. But, that doesn't mean we can be complacent.
Not at all. Informed discussion is vital.
So what are your thoughts on all this? This intersection of citizenship, rights, government power. It's complex, and the conversation is clearly far from over.